If you've been following along with Legends of Runeterra on its Reddit or through YouTube, you may have seen a few decks discussed at great length as being a bit overpowered. Specifically, Shen FIORA Barrier, WARMOTHER Control, INEVITABILITY Shenanigans, JINX Draven Discard Aggro, and Zed Hecarim Ephemerals. From my experience in the last preview patch, this is both far too small a list of top tier decks, and some of them don't even feel close to top tier to me. So, in this video, I'm going to go through all of the decks that I'm aware of, every single one, though I won't be going into a ton of detail about each. I'm also going to give some tentative tier ratings to each archetype or list based on my testing. I'm aware it's early, but this should give you a broad view of what things might be worth checking out come open beta, or at least what things you might want to start thinking about teching against in your decks. My tiers are based on where I'd expect the lists to fall in their win percentage, so D tier is 45% or lower, C tier is 45 to 50%, B tier is 50 to 55%, A tier is 55 to 60%, and the S tier lists are 60% or higher. Oh, and one more quick note. I talk sometimes about linking different archetypes and deck lists. That's because they're in the description below. I've actually added a transcript for the entirety of this video there. Alright, let's go. I've got 32 different archetypes or deck lists to review, so this one's going to be a two-parter. Alright, first off, let's talk about luck stuff. Decks in this archetype generally try to use the Spells Matter theme to play a control-y game plan to buy time until Lux is able to come out, then using effects such as Flash of Brilliance, Static Shock, and Detain to quickly flip her. Once she is out, she can provide an effective means by which to keep the opposing board clear, while slowly chunking them down with attacks each turn. In the perfect world, she normally gets flanked by cards such as Assembly Bot, so that there is another threat than just Lux. Unfortunately, Lux is just overall a pretty weak card, and most of the shells that let you get good value from her also rely on you running Piltover and Zon, which means you don't get to protect her very effectively using something like Ionia. Additionally, against hard control decks, the Final Sparks are basically a dead card because they can't target the enemy Nexus, and against aggro decks, most of them will just kill Lux decks before she comes online in my experience. Solidly D tier rating based on my testing. Professor Von Yipp is a strong synergy card alongside Weenie decks, utilizing predominantly one-cost units. An interesting quirk of him, though, is that because his effect triggers on summon, cards which generate tokens, which also have mana costs in Legends of Runeterra, also can get this benefit. This means, for example, that in a deck running Jury Rig, Yipp can give you a 3/3 at burst speed for 1 mana, which is pretty dang sick. Professor Von Yipp is a card which I didn't see played a single time in either preview patch. That being said, I've seen some rumblings of the archetype actually being pretty strong. Of the two decks I'm linking here, I think the Spiders one is likely far stronger, simply due to the spider summoning effects such as Elise, Vile Feast, and Crawling Sensation. Having the Elise spiders gain Challenger, but also be bigger boys, does seem sweet. Whilst Yipp has a lot to offer in the best case scenario, I don't think that these decks are likely to be too effective. If his ability were on a champion, it'd actually be a different story, as you could add lots of consistency with Entreat, but as a follower, any deck sufficiently able to get value from him also intrinsically lacks some consistency. His body is also pretty weak in its own right, and by taking up a slot on the crowded board, he actually stops you from going as wide as his effect would normally want you to in other games. I think this deck is probably a D tier deck, but I could see the Shadow Isles version maybe pushing into C tier. We've got two different decks to talk about in this archetype, but in reality most colors can do the Poro thing, as basically every color has some early game Poro. The trick with Poro decks is that basically anything you play isn't for its own sake, but rather to combo with Heart of the Fluffed, which eats all your other Poros to make one big boy Poro. The resulting Abomination also has a Last Breath effect that summons a Poro if it is removed. The entire premise of this deck is to rush towards an unmanageable follower quite early in the game, so being able to play something like Poro Herder, which draws 2 Poros from your deck, is also an important part of this list though. This archetype, unfortunately, is trash in my opinion. I don't think it's too surprising, but needed to be said. Against any deck worth its salt that has a healthy splash of effects for board control, there is no world where Poros win unless the draw is abysmal from the other side. D tier here. Self-damage effects have some strong payoffs in Legends of Runeterra, both on the giving and receiving side of the damage. One deck which many have attempted to build is the Braum plus Vladimir deck, which has the benefit where even if you don't draw the payoffs for self-damage from Noxus, Braum and the Scar clans also benefit from the effects. This deck isn't actually one that I think we should spend too much time talking about. It revolves around a very win more plan, where you're assuming that you can keep your board and make profitable attacks regardless of needing to weaken your own units. The payoffs are strong in a vacuum, but really don't seem like a mechanic destined for any place other than expeditions. This one is a D tier list in my opinion. Okay, so let's get this one out of the way. Elnuks do have better math than you might think, but there is no way this archetype is worth running right now. The biggest issue is that when the troop summons the Onyx to the battlefield, like Kinkou Wayfinder, these are actual copies from your deck, meaning that future troops become way less effective unless you're playing the Mimi Parade version. To have everything which needs to happen work out with this concept, you also need to not be playing against a deck that can deal with these Elnuks, which doesn't seem very likely to me. Every deck in my A and S tier is going to be able to handle this pretty easily, especially if they know what you're up to. I've linked the best looking Elnuk deck that I can find, and I'd say that it is the best Elnuk deck that I found due to it not being overly dependent on Elnuks. I also included a list that I threw together while trying to think of a way to make Elnuks make sense, which has never been tested, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's an interesting concept. I still think it's D tier. Gambling is pretty fun, and this deck proves it. Using Kinkou Wayfinder when you have almost exclusively Ionian cards in your deck, and the only 1-mana card happens to be the only non-Ionian card, and it's Teemo, all but ensures that you're going to be proccing Allegiance so as to speed out multiple Teemos early. Some versions of this list also run one other PNZ card, Counterfeit Copies, and I think this might actually be the only deck in the game, currently at least, which actually should. This is because in some instances you can end up drawing your combo pieces and turning off your combo, as the Wayfinder requires the unit it is pulling to be in your deck. Whilst this deck is definitely super fun, it's also pretty bad, I think. The consistency of it is actually not the biggest issue that I see with it. The biggest issue is the fact that Teemos aren't summoned as copies, but actually pulled from your deck to be deployed. Most decks are going to be able to deal with 2 Teemos pretty quickly, and considering that we're trying to maximize our chances at hitting Teemo, Teemo itself is normally the only mushroom card in the deck, which means you're never really going to be able to get the mushroom plan off. If Ionia ever gets to a point where a mono-colored Ionia aggro deck is actually top tier, then this skew of that list might actually be pretty strong. But until then, I feel like the game plan of the deck is just diluted by trying to play this gimmick. It's D tier, I think. The aggro version is definitely stronger, but I have a tough time seeing its place in the meta, so I'm going to say C tier on that version. The premise of stun recall decks is to level up your Yasuo while keeping the board clear, either utilizing a control plan of eventually dropping some big units to attack a stunned or clear board, or by tempoing the enemy board out while getting in with early damage. In either instance, the name of the game of this deck is Tempo. Cards such as Steel Tempest, Will of Ionia, and Intimidating Roar can gain you a lot of time, considering that your opponent can ordinarily only attack every other turn. Yone, Windchaser, and Mina Swiftfoot are incredible cards in the late game that allow for you to shut off a lot of mana from your opponent, while also being robust bodies in their own right. There is some discussion online about playing Katarina or not in this list, and to be honest, I think it actually depends on which skew of the archetype you're playing. She definitely fits a lot better in the aggressive version. One of the other skews of the Yasuo deck actually utilizes Freylord, too, instead of Noxus, and goes in an even more hard control direction. This one is pretty interesting, and I feel the least sure about where it ought to be placed. I think I only played against it maybe twice during the second preview patch, and I beat it both times. To me, it feels like the deck would be better suited from honing in more as a Karma Ash control list, or more the route of a normal Yasuo one. Yasuo is a very parasitic design in his reliance on such a narrow supporting cast of cards. With that being said, once you add his core cards, there are 2 main ways to build the decks. As I mentioned, one is more the control shell, one's more the aggressive combo list. Of the 2, I think the aggro list is far better. The reason for this is that similar to Ezreal Noxus Burn, you require the opponent to play units for you to get the full effect from your cards, and not all decks are going to do that. Additionally, some lists would love nothing more than for you to return their play summon effects to the hand. In some instances, you'll have the stun to get around that, but not always. Therefore, I think the better version is one which can actually utilize the tempo of these effects to pressure, rather than eventually develop one big turn into the late game. Aggro gets a C tier from me, but Control Noxus and Control Freylord both get D tier. Heimerdinger is a big fan of spells, and who can help give you lots of spells? Karma, of course. This deck can get very out of control in the late game by comboing Cloud Drinker with Insight of Ages and Flash of Brilliance to play lots and lots of cards. This deck doesn't really run finishers outside of Heimerdinger, so make sure you protect him as best you can. This is a deck that I believe I originally saw a streamer playing in Phase 1. Perhaps Disguised Toaster Dog, but I can't recall for sure. Surprisingly, though, I've not been able to find it on Mobalytics, so I went ahead and recreated what I recall it being. I tried this deck out myself in the Phase 2 patch, and it felt pretty middling in its performance. It doesn't move especially fast, and doesn't have access to the SI cards, which I believe are pretty needed for most control game plans right now. That being said, once it goes off, it really goes off, and at the very least, this deck is super fun to play. It's also surprisingly challenging to play well, as you often end up having too full a hand and board due to Karma and Heimerdinger in the late game. This deck is a C tier for me, though in some metas where it's overly controlling, it could maybe be a B tier deck, just because of the fact that it does generate a lot of value. This deck is somewhat of an offshoot of the Rekindler Value Town archetype, but can be built in ways not purely revolving around that card. The idea is to work around Teemo's unfortunate fragility and keep him coming back so as to make his alternate win condition more of an inevitability than a possibility. These decks play slowly but surely, using value tools such as Mist's Call, the Rekindler, Puffcat Peddler, and Chronicler of Ruin to win the attrition game. Depending on the skew of the archetype, these lists also use a lot of SI removal spells to try and avoid losing to decks such as FIORA and WARMOTHER control scary units. Unfortunately, I think that this isn't the best shell to use Teemo. Trying to play slow with such an inconsistent / normally slow speed of game plan is too risky, even if it is inevitable over such a long enough time period. Fun, but a C-tier concept unless the meta slows way down. This list is all about trying to rush down your opponent, while also trying to dump your hand as fast as possible to turn on the super mega powerful leveled up JINX. It has many different discard enablers, such as Flame Chompers, Vision, and Jury Rig, which can utilize the normally detrimental side effect of cards such as Zonite Urchin, Sump Dredger, Get Excited, and Rummage. Because JINX draws you double cards once she flips, the priority isn't to play conservatively, but instead just to burn through your resources ASAP. To be honest, this deck is kind of a head scratcher for me. I've never seen it be particularly effective in any of my games, but there is a contingent of players who seem to believe it is very strong. The deck is comically bad against hard control. I often finished on 20 health playing against it using Atrocity control, for example, and is also not able to be very effective on board. There are a number of skews using different amounts of discard effects versus just trying to play fast with a low curve, and I think the low curve ones are better, but I don't think either is very good. If SI is nerfed quite a bit heading into the beta, then this deck might actually get a lot better though. In my opinion, for now, it's a C-tier deck. Noxus Spiders is an archetype which focuses on flooding the board quickly while buffing up your tribal units with Arachnoid Host and Frenzied Skitterer to try and close out games very quickly. The main reason why the deck uses Noxus is either to add some jet fuel to the tank with Arachnoid Host, or to have a strong finisher with Darius. The deck is pretty vulnerable to board wipes, but it does have some ways to rebuild with Fresh Offerings and Brood Awakening. This is an interesting list, and I think it is borderline good, but I don't think the best skew has yet been found. If you go too focused on tribal and don't have enough supporting non-tribal effects, I think the deck becomes too one-dimensional. But the other direction leads to a question about why you're going tribal spiders at all. I have a feeling there is a good list here, but I also think that spiders might just be better when comboed with Demacia for Lucian and Relentless Pursuit, Remembrance, Dawn Speaker, or Ionia for good aggro stuff and tempo value bouncing. This deck for the time being is a C-tier archetype in my opinion. Ionia Noxus aggro leverages basically all of the most efficient early game aggro units, Legion Rearguard and Sparring Student for an example, to try and end things as quickly as possible. It has very strong supporting champions for this purpose, with Zed and Katarina being excellent and evasive damage threats that in the worst case act as a lightning rod for your other threats to get behind, and in the best case can really turn the pressure up to 11. By only running one Katarina, you're not placed in a position where her constant recall is actually just a mana tax, and instead she's actually a useful finisher, which I think is a really smart addition to this list. I think this deck is definitely among the stronger straight aggro lists in Legends of Runeterra, but when you compare it to aggro lists that actually give you insane amounts of value too, like Lucian and Teemo Standalone, Light and Shadow, and Ephemeral Tribal, it just doesn't stack up that well. This deck gets a C from me. In future sets, it might get much better if it just gets to run all the best efficient aggro stuff though. Legion Marauder is a card which can definitely get out of control pretty quickly. There has been some good theory crafting done on how to best utilize him, but I think the deck here from Swim looks like a decent candidate to me. This isn't something I encountered much, if at all, in testing, but I think the key to making one work is to not be over-reliant on it as the only way the deck wins. Marauder decks need to also have pressure which can be provided otherwise, and they all need to be fast rather than overly combo-y. It just won't be able to keep up with the late game control and ramp decks, I think. There is something to this card, but I think this list is probably only C tier. I do believe that there might be something stronger waiting to be discovered, though. Elites is probably the foremost tribal archetype in Legends of Runeterra's first set. The biggest reason for this is that there are so many effects that alleviate the biggest drawback to playing a tribal/zoo list, although coincidentally, I couldn't find any on Mobalytics that use the cards in question. This deck is mostly just aiming to play on curve threats, which all synergize effectively with one another. There's definitely a delineation between decks which skew more towards aggro or mid-range, with the more aggressive ones being far more likely to splash a second color based on my digging around. In playtesting, I lost to the elite decks a surprising amount. The key similarity between the ones that I lost to were that they always had the rebuild effects that I mentioned before, such as Remembrance, Dawn Speaker, or a Radiant Guardian. If this deck gets an explosive start, it is pretty robust against damaging removal too, especially with Battlesmith draws. I'm not totally sure on my rating for this one, and I think there might be a B tier version somewhere waiting to be discovered, kind of like Marauders, but for now I'm going to give it a C tier. Okay, so I probably don't need to explain how this one works, but let's just get into it. Barriers is an archetype revolving around FIORA and Shen. FIORA is a very unique unit due to her alternate win condition, allowing you to end a game outright if a single copy kills 4 units and survives each of those encounters. FIORA is a pretty effective body for a 3-mana unit, considering she also has access to the Challenger keyword, letting her pick her fights and try and take minimal damage in coming online. The first place that many decks trying to utilize a FIORA win condition look is actually to use barrier cards, which allow for her to get out of situations where an enemy combat trick or removal would punish your attack, but also it allows for her to pick off enemy units without any consequence sometimes. This also naturally works alongside the card Greenglade Caretaker, which can get to dizzying heights of damage pretty easily and incidentally through executing your main FIORA game plan. There are actually 2 main skews to the barrier archetype. The first is almost exclusively focused on getting off the FIORA win condition and runs more barrier effects in addition to running cards like River Shaper, who even if it dies, allows for you to draw more of the effects that you're looking for. The second variant is a more complete aggro game plan that also has cards such as Ghost, which occasionally allow blowout wins using your Greenglade Caretaker to be more easily came upon. Okay, so I guess this is a bit of a hot take, but I'm actually not very fond of this archetype, and I think that it's going to be surprisingly very weak in a developed metagame. The deck is extremely soft to most control decks, as they just have too high a volume of effects which screw up your plans, and against well-tuned aggro lists you can easily be outraced, while they just dodge FIORA through combat tricks. I'm inclined to think that the main reason for this deck's ostensibly dominant performance is just the early development of the metagame and the relative newness of players, who are playing directly into its win condition. I can't tell you how many times I've been watching streamers play this deck, and they just play their things that they can't defend into a FIORA that's on the board whilst talking about the fact that the FIORA is so annoying. Really, it's possible to play around this deck. It gets a C tier from me, and I think it might be supposed to be a D tier, honestly, because I literally had over an 80% win rate against this champion combo with my best decks. This is another one that I probably don't need to explain, but for those unaware, the premise of WARMOTHER's control is to ramp quickly into very large threats such as Tryndamere, She Who Wanders, or a WARMOTHER's Call. The deck uses Catalyst of Aeons and Wording Stones to gain mana quickly, while fending off damage and cycling with Avarosan Sentry, alongside a plethora of Shadow Isles removal spells. Most versions also use Avarosan Hearthguard to make it so that, especially in the mirror matchups, their threats aren't able to be contested, and as a summon effect, it even works when the WARMOTHER's Call pulls it out for you. WARMOTHER Control was definitely a top tier deck during the first preview patch, but after the nerfs it received to 3 key cards, She Who Wanders, Wording Stones, and Withering Wail, I believe it now to be mediocre. I'm of the opinion that once true control lists become more popular, this deck is likely to tighten up its mid-range plan instead and try to go under them, becoming even less of a control list. I suggest checking out this version, which I think has a much more consistent mid-range deck. This list is a solid B tier in my opinion, even with the nerfs, and has mainly been getting away, I think, with the super high win rates that people have been talking about due to an immature metagame. A flipped Ezreal is extremely potent in conjunction with burn effects, as he essentially just adds damage to them. By comboing with Noxus, Ezreal gains access to Blade's Edge, Culling Strike, and Noxian Guillotine, all of which are fantastic spells for the archetype. The fact that you can run Noxian Guillotine single-handedly improves how good Static Shock is, too, which adds a lot of draw to the deck while also being a 2x targeter for Ezreal. Some versions of this list I think could even possibly afford to run Captain Pharaon as a finisher, which I think is actually very good, especially after a reload with Augmented Experimenter, another good add, which counts towards Ezreal, I think. This deck is an interesting one, and I think that a streamlined version that I'm proposing here has actually got a lot of legs, especially in a metagame where a lot of players are using decks such as Shen FIORA or some of the Lucian decks that I'm fond of. With that being said, it has one huge drawback that I believe precludes it from ever reaching truly top-tier status, and that's its reliance on your opponent playing units in a timely fashion. I'm gonna have to give this deck a B-tier rating. FIORA is a card considered to be pretty busted by a large contingent of the player base, even at a 3/3 stat line. Well, what if you could make that even bigger? This archetype focuses on taking FIORA out of range of most combat tricks and damage-based removal spells by using lots of buff cards, such as Standalone, Laurent Bladekeeper, and Chain Vest. A benefit of this is that she actually becomes threatening to the opponent's life total, rather than just being a threat while they have units out which FIORA can eat. This incidentally means that they might be more inclined to feed things to FIORA too, as otherwise, the Nexus damage can get out of control. There are a couple of different variants, with the Freylord variant focusing more on midrange and value, whereas the Ionia skew focuses more on aggro. I'm actually inclined to think that this is a pretty solid list, as it really only gets hard countered by SI decks running Vengeance, and even then only if the buff FIORA list isn't in Ionia and also running Deny. I only faced this about once in Preview Patch 2, so I don't have a lot of personal data, but I'd guess that this is a B-tiered list, possibly pushing into the A tier. This list is in a similar vein to the Draven JINX list, where you're trying to aggro down your opponent with a low-to-the-ground curve. This allows you to flip your JINX and start getting more gas in the tank early to keep pressure on. The biggest difference in this deck is that it almost entirely relying on an early curve, a low curve, to empty your hand rather than explicitly discarding things to empty it out. The only discard enabler that it runs is actually Jury Rig, which actually makes a lot of sense given that it is quite a strong card in its own right, and has some nice synergy with the Zonite Urchin. I actually think this premise is pretty strong, but there are a bunch of edits I feel the deck would benefit from. Specifically adding 3 Shadow Assassins and 2 Get Exciteds by removing 1 Deny, 3 Astute Academics, and 1 Silent Shadow Seeker. Not to go into too much detail right here, I feel like the cards that I'm suggesting removing are kind of just mediocre, and instead of pushing for 2 every turn with the Academic, I'd rather just have the removal to clear the board to push for lethal. I also don't really like Deny being able to stick in hand and prevent Jinx flips. I'd want to test these changes though. The biggest drawback of this deck is the lack of card draw. You'll run out of fuel really fast if Jinx doesn't get top decked. Though, thankfully, if she ever does, she's almost guaranteed to flip immediately. I think the deck is probably B or C tier, but I'm going to go with B. Okay, that wraps up part 1 of my tier list, and all of the archetypes and decks from D through B tier. Be sure to check back soon to see which ones land in the A and S tiers. And also, please be sure to comment your thoughts on these below, and like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content.